In the harsh frontier town of Red Creek, Texas, 1887, a grieving cowboy named Samuel Sam Crawford finds himself bound by an unusual court order after a tragic accident. When his horse accidentally tramples a merchant's cart, killing the man and leaving his young widow Martha Henderson destitute, the judge sentences Sam to an unconventional punishment, marriage to the widow to provide for her and her young son. What begins as a reluctant arrangement born of guilt and legal obligation slowly transforms into something neither expected, as Martha's resilient spirit and gentle smile begin to heal Sam's wounded heart, while he learns that sometimes the greatest crimes can lead to the most unexpected redemptions. Please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and comment where you're watching this incredible story from. The autumn wind swept across the dusty main street of Red Creek, Texas, carrying with it the scent of dried sage and the distant sound of cattle lowing. Samuel Crawford pulled his worn hat lower over his eyes as he guided his black stallion Thunder toward the general store. The year was 1887, and the frontier town buzzed with the usual afternoon activity: merchants calling out their wares, children playing in the dirt streets, and cowboys preparing for another night at the Silver Dollar Saloon. Sam had been riding hard for 3 days, returning from a cattle drive that had taken him as far as Amarillo. His weathered face bore the lines of a man who had seen too much sorrow for his 32 years. The death of his wife, Caroline, 2 years prior, had left him a hollow shell of the man he once was. She had died giving birth to what would have been their first child, taking both mother and baby in one cruel stroke of fate. Since then, Sam had thrown himself into his work, spending more time on the range than in the small cabin they had shared on the outskirts of town. Thunder's hooves clicked rhythmically against the hard-packed earth as they made their way down Main Street. The horse was tired, having covered nearly 60 miles in the past day, but Sam was eager to collect his pay from the cattle drive and perhaps drown his sorrows in a bottle of whiskey. The weight of loneliness had become his constant companion, heavier than his gun belt and more persistent than the Texas heat. As they approached Henderson's general store, Sam noticed a commotion near the loading dock. A merchant was unloading crates from a wagon, while a woman in a faded blue dress supervised the arrangement of goods. Her auburn hair caught the afternoon sunlight, and even from a distance Sam could see she carried herself with a dignity that seemed out of place in this rough frontier town. Thunder suddenly shied at something, perhaps a snake or a piece of blowing paper, and reared up on his hind legs. Sam, exhausted from the long journey and caught off guard, struggled to maintain control. The stallion's front hooves came down hard, but instead of finding solid ground, they struck the corner of a wooden crate that had been placed too close to the street. The crate splintered with a loud crack, sending its contents, expensive china dishes, cascading to the ground in a symphony of breaking porcelain. But worse than the destroyed merchandise was what happened next. The merchant, a thin man named Robert Henderson, lunged forward to save what he could of his valuable inventory. In his haste, he stumbled directly into Thunder's path. The massive horse, still panicked and fighting against Sam's attempts to control him, struck the man with his full weight. Henderson crumpled to the ground with a sickening thud, his neck bent at an unnatural angle. The woman in the blue dress screamed, a sound that pierced through the afternoon air and brought every person on Main Street running toward the tragic scene. Sam finally brought Thunder under control and leaped from the saddle, his heart pounding with horror at what had just transpired. He knelt beside the motionless merchant, checking for signs of life. But it was clear that Robert Henderson was dead. The man's neck had been broken in the fall, and his eyes stared unseeing at the vast Texas sky above. The woman, who Sam now realized must be Henderson's wife, fell to her knees beside her husband's body, her hands trembling as she reached out to touch his face. Her sobs were quiet but heartbreaking, the kind of grief that cuts deeper than any scream. A young boy, perhaps 7 years old, appeared from inside the store and stood frozen in the doorway, his wide eyes taking in the scene of his father's death. Sheriff Jim Butler arrived within minutes, his heavy boots crunching on the broken china as he surveyed the accident. A crowd had gathered, murmuring among themselves about the tragic turn of events. Sam stood with his hat in his hands, his face pale with shock and guilt. He had killed a man, accidentally, but the result was the same. Robert Henderson was dead, leaving behind a widow and a young son with no means of support. "This was an accident, Sheriff," called out Doc Morrison, who had examined the body. "Horse-spooked man tried to save his goods, got in the way, no malice intended." But Sam knew that intention mattered little to the widow now cradling her husband's head in her lap, or to the boy who would never see his father again. The sheriff questioned Sam about the incident while the undertaker was summoned. Sam explained about the long journey, Thunder's exhaustion, and the sudden spook that had caused the fatal accident. Throughout his testimony, he kept glancing at the widow, whose quiet dignity in the face of such sudden tragedy both impressed and tormented him. 3 days later, Sam found himself standing before Judge Cornelius Whitmore in the small courthouse that doubled as the town meeting hall. The judge was a stern man in his 60s, with silver whiskers and piercing gray eyes that seemed to see straight through to a man's soul. He had served as Red Creek's judge for over 15 years, and his reputation for unconventional but fair justice was known throughout the county. Martha Henderson sat in the front row, dressed in black mourning clothes that made her pale skin appear almost translucent. Her son, Tommy, clung to her side, his small hand gripping hers tightly. Sam couldn't help but notice how the boy's eyes held a mixture of fear and confusion. Too young to fully understand death, but old enough to know his world had been shattered. "Samuel Crawford," Judge Whitmore's voice boomed through the small courtroom. "You stand before this court charged with causing the death of Robert Henderson through negligent operation of your horse. While the court acknowledges this was an accident, the fact remains that your actions, however unintentional, have resulted in the death of a husband and father, leaving a widow and child without means of support." Sam's lawyer, a young man named Benjamin Curtis who had recently arrived from Dallas, stood to address the court. "Your Honor, my client deeply regrets this tragic accident. Mr. Crawford was exhausted from a 3-day cattle drive, and his horse was spooked by unknown circumstances. There was no criminal intent, no malice aforethought. This was purely an unfortunate accident." The judge nodded gravely, then turned his attention to the gathered townspeople who filled every available seat. In frontier communities like Red Creek, everyone knew everyone else's business, and the unusual nature of this case had drawn considerable interest. "The court recognizes the accidental nature of Mr. Henderson's death," he continued, "but we must also consider the practical consequences of this tragedy." He gestured toward Martha and Tommy Henderson. "Mrs. Henderson has lost not only her husband but also the family's sole source of income. The general store was their livelihood, and without Mr. Henderson's business expertise and connections with suppliers in Dallas and Houston, she cannot hope to maintain the enterprise. She has no family in Texas, having come here from Missouri with her late husband 5 years ago." Sam felt his stomach tighten as he realized where the judge's reasoning was leading. In frontier justice, practical solutions often took precedence over legal technicalities. The community's survival depended on everyone contributing, and leaving a widow and child destitute was not only morally wrong but economically unsustainable for a small town. Furthermore, Judge Whitmore continued, "Mr. Crawford owns one of the most successful ranches in the county. He has the means to provide for Mrs. Henderson and her son, and indeed, given that his actions caused their current predicament, he bears a moral obligation to do so." The judge paused, allowing his words to sink in before delivering his verdict. "Therefore, this court sentences Samuel Crawford to marriage with Martha Henderson within 30 days, with the understanding that he will provide for her and her son as if they were his own family. This union will ensure that Mrs. Henderson has both financial security and social standing in our community, while Mr. Crawford fulfills his obligation to those harmed by his actions." A collective gasp rose from the courtroom. Even in the frontier, where unusual legal remedies were not uncommon, a court-ordered marriage was extraordinary. Sam felt the blood drain from his face, while Martha Henderson's eyes widened in shock. She had known something would need to be done about her situation, but this was beyond anything she had imagined. "Your Honor," Benjamin Curtis protested, "surely there must be alternative arrangements. My client could provide financial support without the necessity of marriage, perhaps a monthly payment." "Counselor," the judge interrupted firmly, "monthly payments require trust and good faith, commodities that can disappear when times get hard or when a man decides to leave town. Marriage creates legal obligations that protect Mrs. Henderson's interests and ensure her son receives proper care and education. Furthermore, it provides her with the social status necessary to function in our community." Judge Whitmore's logic was sound, even if his solution was unconventional. In 1887, Texas, an unmarried woman with a child faced significant social and economic challenges. Marriage would give Martha legal protection and social respectability, while ensuring Tommy had a father figure and the Crawford name to carry him through life. "Mr. Crawford," the judge addressed Sam directly, "do you accept this sentence, or do you prefer 30 days in jail followed by financial restitution that may or may not adequately address the harm you've caused?" Sam looked at Martha Henderson, who sat rigid with shock, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Her son pressed closer to her, sensing the gravity of the moment even if he couldn't understand its implications. The weight of his guilt pressed down on Sam like a boulder. He had taken this woman's husband, this boy's father. If marriage was what it took to make amends, then perhaps it was fitting justice. "I accept the court sentence, Your Honor," Sam said quietly, his voice carrying to every corner of the silent courtroom. The 30 days leading up to the wedding passed like a strange, suspended dream for both Sam and Martha. The judge had given them time to make arrangements, but the awkwardness of their situation permeated every interaction. Sam moved out of his cabin and into the hotel above the Silver Dollar Saloon, giving Martha and Tommy space to grieve and adjust to their new reality in the small apartment behind the general store. During the first week, their conversations were limited to practical matters. Sam would arrive each morning to help with the store's inventory and financial records, learning the intricacies of Robert Henderson's business relationships. He discovered that Martha was far more involved in the store's operations than he had initially assumed. She knew every supplier, every customer's preferences, and every detail of the complex credit arrangements that kept the frontier economy functioning. "Robert always said I had a head for numbers," Martha explained one afternoon as she showed Sam the ledger books. "He handled the traveling and negotiations with suppliers, but I managed everything here in town." Her voice caught slightly when she mentioned her late husband, but she composed herself quickly. Sam noticed she never cried in front of him, maintaining a dignity that both impressed and distanced him. Tommy proved to be more of a challenge. The boy regarded Sam with a mixture of fear and resentment that was perfectly understandable given the circumstances. Sam had killed his father, and now he was going to replace him. The logic of adults meant nothing to a 7-year-old's broken heart. "I don't want a new papa," Tommy declared one morning when Sam tried to help him with his chores. "I want my real papa back." The words hit Sam like a physical blow, reminding him that his actions had shattered more than just china dishes that terrible afternoon. But as the days passed, small moments began to chip away at the walls between them. Sam discovered that Tommy was fascinated by horses, and despite his fear of thunder, the horse that had caused his father's death, the boy couldn't help asking questions about ranch life. Sam found himself telling stories of cattle drives and wild mustangs, watching as Tommy's eyes lit up with curiosity despite his determination to remain distant. Martha, meanwhile, proved to be an enigma that Sam couldn't quite solve. She was unfailingly polite but never warm, efficient but never comfortable in his presence. He caught glimpses of the woman beneath the grief. A quick smile when Tommy made a joke, a gentle laugh when Mrs. Patterson from the church brought over a casserole, a moment of fierce pride when she successfully negotiated a better price with a supplier from Austin. The wedding preparations themselves were handled by the church ladies, led by the indomitable Mrs. Eleanor Fitzgerald, who had organized every social event in Red Creek for the past decade. They treated the unusual circumstances with the same attention to detail they would give any wedding, perhaps understanding that normalcy was what Martha needed most. "Every bride deserves a proper wedding dress," Mrs. Fitzgerald declared, producing a beautiful cream-colored gown that had belonged to her daughter. "We'll alter it to fit you perfectly, dear. A woman should feel beautiful on her wedding day, regardless of the circumstances." Sam watched from a distance as the women rallied around Martha, providing the support and companionship that helped ease her isolation. He realized that the judge's solution wasn't just about financial security, it was about community acceptance and belonging. As his wife, Martha would have a place in Red Creek society that she could never achieve as a destitute widow. 3 days before the wedding, Sam encountered Martha alone in the store's back room, sorting through Robert's personal belongings. She held a small wooden horse that Robert had carved for Tommy, turning it over in her hands with infinite care. For the first time since the accident, Sam saw her facade crack. "He was going to teach Tommy to carve," she said softly, not looking up. "He said every boy should know how to work with his hands to create something beautiful from nothing." A single tear fell onto the wooden horse, and Sam felt his throat tighten with emotion. "I could teach him," Sam offered quietly. "I learned wood carving from my father. It's not the same as learning from Robert, but if you think Tommy might like it." Martha looked up at him then, really looked at him, for perhaps the first time since the accident. Her green eyes searched his face, looking for something. Sincerity, perhaps, or genuine kindness. Whatever she found there must have satisfied her, because she nodded slowly. "I think he would like that," she said. "Thank you, Sam." It was the first time she had used his name, and hearing it from her lips stirred something unexpected in his chest. For a moment, the weight of guilt lifted, replaced by something that might in time become hope. The wedding took place on a crisp October morning in the Red Creek Baptist Church. The small wooden building was filled with nearly every resident of the town, drawn by curiosity as much as genuine goodwill. Sam stood at the altar in his best black suit, his hands trembling slightly as he waited for Martha to walk down the aisle. Reverend Thomas McKay, who had married dozens of couples in his 20 years of service, had never before officiated a court-ordered wedding, but he approached the ceremony with the same reverence he showed all his congregants. When Martha appeared at the back of the church, Sam's breath caught in his throat. The cream-colored dress transformed her from the grieving widow he had come to know into something ethereal and beautiful. Her auburn hair was arranged in an elegant style beneath a simple veil, and she carried a small bouquet of wildflowers that Mrs. Fitzgerald had gathered from the prairie. Tommy walked beside her, dressed in his finest clothes, his small hand gripping hers tightly. The ceremony was brief but dignified. When Reverend McKay asked if Sam would take Martha as his lawfully wedded wife, to love and cherish her in sickness and health, Sam's voice was steady and clear. "I do." Martha's response was quieter but equally firm. They exchanged simple gold bands that Sam had purchased from the town's only jeweler, and when the Reverend pronounced them husband and wife, Sam leaned down to give Martha the traditional kiss. It was meant to be perfunctory, a mere formality to seal their legal union. But when their lips met, Sam felt something unexpected, a spark of genuine connection that had nothing to do with obligation or guilt. Martha's eyes widened slightly, suggesting she had felt it too. But the moment passed quickly as the congregation applauded, and they turned to face their new community as a married couple. The reception was held in the church hall, with the entire town contributing food and music. Sam watched as Martha moved through the crowd, accepting congratulations and well wishes with grace. She smiled politely at everyone, but Sam noticed that none of those smiles reached her eyes. They were the practiced expressions of a woman doing her duty, playing the role expected of her. As the evening wore on, Sam found himself standing alone on the church steps, needing air and a moment to process the magnitude of what had just occurred. He was married again, bound to a woman he barely knew, responsible for a child who barely tolerated him. The weight of his new obligations felt heavier than any burden he had carried on the cattle trails. "Mr. Crawford?" Tommy's small voice interrupted his thoughts. The boy stood in the doorway, his formal clothes now rumpled from an evening of play with the other children. "Mama says it's time to go home now." Home. The word struck Sam with unexpected force. For 2 years, home had been an empty cabin filled with memories of Caroline. Now it would be the apartment behind the general store, shared with a woman who married him out of necessity and a child who saw him as the man who killed his father. They walked the short distance to the store in silence, Tommy between them, Martha's hand resting lightly on Sam's arm as propriety demanded. Once inside, Martha immediately busied herself with preparing Tommy for bed, while Sam stood awkwardly in what was now supposed to be his living space. "I've prepared the spare room for you," Martha said when she returned from tucking Tommy in. I assumed you would prefer your own space for now." Sam nodded, grateful for her consideration. "That's very thoughtful. I don't want to make this any more difficult than it already is." For a moment they stood in the small sitting room, two strangers bound by law and circumstance, uncertain how to proceed. Then Tommy appeared in his nightshirt, clutching the wooden horse his father had carved. "I forgot to say goodnight," he said solemnly to Sam. It was the first voluntary interaction the boy had initiated, and Sam felt a flutter of hope. "Good night, Tommy," Sam replied gently. "Sleep well." As the boy returned to his room, Martha began clearing away the tea things from their evening meal. Sam moved to help her, and their hands accidentally touched as they both reached for the same cup. Martha pulled back quickly, but not before Sam noticed the slight blush that colored her cheeks. "Martha," he said softly, "I want you to know that I don't expect, that is, I understand this marriage is for practical purposes. I'll try to be a good provider and a decent stepfather to Tommy, but I don't want you to feel obligated to be anything more than you're comfortable being." She looked up at him then, and for a moment her carefully maintained composure slipped. "You're very kind, Sam. More than I expected." She paused, seeming to struggle with something. "I know this isn't what either of us would have chosen, but perhaps we can find a way to make it work." It was then that it happened, the moment that would change everything between them. Tommy called out from his bedroom asking for a drink of water, and when Martha smiled at the familiar request, it was genuine and unguarded. The smile transformed her entire face, lighting up her green eyes and revealing the warmth that grief had hidden. In that instant, Sam saw not the tragic widow he had been obligated to marry, but the remarkable woman she truly was. The smile lasted only a second before Martha hurried to tend to her son, but it was enough. Sam stood frozen in the small sitting room, his heart pounding with the realization that his feelings for Martha Henderson Crawford had just shifted from duty to something far more dangerous and wonderful. As he prepared for bed in his small room, Sam understood that the judge's unconventional sentence had given him more than just a way to atone for his guilt. It had given him a chance at happiness he never expected to find again. And tomorrow he would begin the patient work of earning Martha's trust and perhaps, in time, her love. The end.